Hi, everyone. I'm Leatrice Elzey. I am the executive director of the Hammonds House Museum. And thank you so much for joining us tonight for another episode of Conversations about Jazz and Other Distractions with Carl Anthony. So we are so happy to have you here tonight. And so we're going to jump into a wonderful show, a show that, so many evenings we have the musicians and we have the producers and we have the songwriters, but it's, a great opportunity tonight to go behind the music to the on the side that's more academic, the side that deals with ethnomusicology. So we're going to have those kind of conversations this evening. So before we get started, let's go ahead and take care of the housekeeping and thank those people who keep our lights on, who keep everything going at the Hammonds House Museum. So we first like to thank Fulton County Arts and Culture, and through the Fulton County Board of Commissioners. And we really do appreciate them for their ongoing support, 32 years strong. And so we appreciate that, especially as a small nonprofit organization. That type of support, you can't buy it any place. And that level of commitment to arts and culture is really, really important. We'd also like to thank the City of Atlanta, Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, AT&T Time Warner, and as well as the National Performance Network out of New Orleans. And so we'd like to thank all of those people in those institutions for just standing with us, standing in a gap for us, quite frankly. And we really do appreciate their support. And then I also have to always thank our members and our donors, because you all are, you're the backbone. Not only do you support, you show up, you come to our virtual events. You always came to the museum when the museum was open. We miss the museum being open. We miss seeing you all and welcoming you to the museum. And so we look forward to the day that we're going to be able to do that again. So hopefully that's going to be very, very soon. So right now, I'd like to go ahead and invite Carl Anthony into the stream. Carl, come on in.
Good evening, Leatrice. How are you?
I am doing well, Carl. How are you?
I'm doing absolutely fabulous. And boy, do we have a great show tonight.
I know. Tell me a little bit about your guest.
Let me do that when I introduce them. They're educators, they're musicians, and we're going to, like I said, talk about ethnomusicology and, get a good understanding of what it's about and how it affects the music, and, just let them tell their side of the story. Like you said earlier, we have musicians, we have songwriters, producers, but we never talk about the academia side of it. And too many of these musicians spend so much time in school learning their craft that we need to let the public know just how all this comes about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And here's a little known fact, when I was thinking about a master's degree, and I was kind of like, okay, so what type of master's degree goes with what I love, because I was figuring if I'm going to get a master's, I'm going to do it in something that I really, really love. And so I thought about anthropology and I thought about ethnomusicology. Those were the two choices that, I had. Unfortunately, I have not yet had time to go after that master's degree. I'm still trying to find time, but it's never too late. I'm going to be like 75 years old getting my degree in ethnomusicology. But by that time, I would have gone through all of this, all my experiences with music and musicians and the history. I'm going to be a straight A student.
It's going to be a breeze for you by that time.
Exactly. By that time, I'll be graduating magna cum laude. So anyway, have an amazing show, Carl. I can't wait to hear everything. And so I'm going to jump on out.
All right. And good evening again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Conversations about Jazz and Other Distractions. It's been nearly a year since this pandemic hit, and it's time to talk to the ethnomusicologist, the academia side of jazz. My first guest is not only an educator, an author, an ordained preacher, and a world-class vocalist. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University. Please welcome Dr. Alisha Lola Jones.
Good evening.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. And
glad to be here.
Joining her is also an author and tenor saxophonist and professor of music African American Studies and Anthropology at the Indiana University, Dr. Gabriel Solis.
Great to see you. Good to be here.
Thank you. And last but not least, he is a recorded and touring saxophonist with the Brian Blade Fellowship and associate professor of musicology at the University of Miami. Please welcome Dr. Melvin Butler. Welcome to the conversation, sir.
Hi, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's begin with the latest pandemic, not to diminish the ongoing social and environmental pandemics that we've been dealing with. It's been nearly a year since COVID has changed the business landscape of the world and impacted those in front and behind the mic in the entertainment industry. As educators and musicians, how have you been adapting to this new paradigm we're living in? And let's start with you, Dr. Jones.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for having me here and giving me the opportunity to chat with some of my favorite conversation partners. I would have to say that in many ways, because where I frequent in my research and just my passion is in religious settings. And so there's been a lot of scurrying to figure out how to make meaning in faith and belief in community choirs that are housed at churches. And so folks are literally getting their technological literacy and weight up as various events occur. You know, people preparing for things like Kwanzaa, learning how to use video conferencing. And what is lost when you incorporate things like video conferencing and conference calls? And so I think I'm witnessing a mourning. I'm witnessing how people are realizing that live interaction as we've known it is no more.
Yeah.
No. Oh,
I'm sorry. I just was going to say, I mean, I also think with both for myself and with my students, I'm really seeing a sense of loss, but also an opportunity to think about the ways that music, as you know, student musicians and other aspects of their lives are really intertwined, so that they may most of the time they may come to see us and we know them as a student, but we don't always know them, you know, in the bigger life that they live. And, you know, to hear from a student that a family member has COVID, I might not have known a family member had an illness before, but now I know that other things they're struggling with and working with. And so that's been really powerful. But similarly, the music that I work with and the music that I teach and the music that I'm most interested in and connected to is live music, is music in community settings, and you know, it's about being together. And as much as I see a lot of students, you know, honing their technical skills, which is good, and honing their technological skills, which is good, we really can't wait to get back to the chance to make music together.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add to that as well. I mean, you know, for me, I mean, as a saxophone player and as a scholar, well, you know, I think I'm grateful for being able to operate in more than one musical world. And this is something I also try to instill in my students as well, is there's a lot of ways to impact the world through music. Live performance is one of them. And I do miss performing. It's been a bit of an adjustment. I have to challenge myself to find time to practice. The last live performance I did was February of 2020 at the Ground Up Festival here in Miami. And since then, it's just mostly been, you know, I've sort of leaned into the art of teaching. And, you know, I really enjoy teaching a lot. And as a music professor, I actually find that the online format has worked fairly well for the kinds of classes that I teach. You know, you can still listen together with students. You can share music, you can share videos. And so I've kind of embraced this sort of technological turn. At the same time, I'm also pretty optimistic. I think if one of the things that we've learned throughout this pandemic is that we still need to be together socially.
Yeah.
You know, and I just think if anything, it's reminded maybe all of us of the importance of making music together and hearing music in community. So I think it's coming back. I think people are thirsty for that kind of live music making experience, and I'm eager to see this happen.
Yeah, because I mean, what I've discovered was we kind of take that camaraderie, that togetherness for granted, because it's always been there. You know, it's like you don't miss what you've never missed until you miss, until it's gone, kind of thing. So
So the interesting thing, though, as the vocalist in the group, is we're already germaphobes. You know what I'm saying? So it's for us already. I see my colleagues at Jacobs. I mean, they are singing with masks, trying to model an awareness of the sort of barrier that we already are. Y'all know the ones with the scarves and the water bottle and the tea and the maintenance so that the community can be built up. So there's already this anxiety. And then with this sort of, issue biologically that folks are navigating, at the very least, I think that there will be some modifications for the vocalists who already are trained to be very wary of germs.
Yeah. I'll say, I mean, even during the during the pandemic, I'm in a small town and we've had pretty good, Champaign-Urbana is, 150,000 people maybe. We've had, the university's been really, really good at like good protocols and a lot of testing, and we've done pretty well. So we had a lot of outdoor music in the fall till, Midwestern winter. It's too cold now. But in the fall, the city sort of relaxed ordinances, allowed a lot of outdoor stages to be set up. All the venues had things. There was a lot of jazz, and people came out. Bigger numbers of people came out to hear live music than would usually go out. And I think when the spring comes and we can have outdoor music again, people will be there for it.
But they're socially distancing, right?
Right, exactly. So, I mean, outdoors, wear a mask, sit a little ways from each other.
It's one of the great things about being in South Florida, for me, here in Miami, where I teach at the, music with the palm trees and 75-degree weather in January. All throughout the year, and I was so impressed by our students because, and teachers, the teachers who teach lessons and ensembles, a lot of them just moved outside. That was their way of adjusting. And so the soundscape of our campus has really changed, I think, for the better. And I think now that people have learned, we can have this ensemble outside, and why not? It's gorgeous outside. They may continue to do this even after we are no longer having to wear masks and things, but it works really well to be in South Florida during a time like this. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah. I feel you. I really do. Yeah. So let's talk about ethnomusicology. We've all heard this term over the years, and we really don't know what it is. It sounds real cool. It's clearly, you see ethno, okay, that's got to be Black folk, kind of thing, But what is ethnomusicology, and why is it important to study? Anyone? Don't be shy.
Well, I'll jump in on this one. This is something we think about, I think, as ethnomusicologists, we think about a lot. In fact, you might argue that the practitioners within our discipline have been somewhat obsessed over the past half century or so with self-definition. What is ethnomusicology? Who are we? What are we doing? What are we supposed to doing? What are we supposed to be doing? And I feel like the definition has shifted a bit over the years as well. I mean, whereas maybe in the early days, when the Society for Ethnomusicology was founded in the mid-1950s, it was kind of viewed, by, as a kind of alternative to a more Eurocentric focus, right? That, we want to study all of the world's music, right? And I feel like since then, and I'm curious what my co-panelists think about this. I feel like the emphasis nowadays tends to be a little bit more on method, and as ethnomusicologists, we define ourselves as as studying people making music, maybe a people-centered approach to music making. We tend to do field work and ethnographic work, interviews. We're interested in, how people are making music meaningful. But, really, I think that ethnomusicology can be defined in lots of different ways, depending on who you ask. There's all kinds of different subfields and sister and brother disciplines and different kinds of approaches.
Yeah, I would agree. I succinctly would say at a dinner party, I like to study the musicians and their audiences, similar to what Dr. Butler mentioned. But I think we could agree that we often get that question, which is why I typically introduce myself as a music researcher, just so we can get to the music.
Yeah, that's right.
I've learned that.
Yes.
Yeah, I have tended, especially, when I'm introducing myself to somebody I might want to work with, to say I'm a music scholar and see where we go from that. But I think one thing that does often distinguish ethnomusicology is an interest not only in the most sort of famous or visible musicians, but in a wide array. So I often am interested in work that's with musicians who maybe aren't stars, right, but are making music in their lives, and sort of how and why are they doing that, and how does that connect to the larger kind of world that includes those musicians who are stars, who I'm also, of course, very interested in. So that's
Yeah. And as ethnomusicologists too, I think it's important to, to emphasize that we don't really place limitations on the kind of music that we study. We really believe that all of the world's musics are pretty much worthy of, analysis and study, and that, that they, and that we don't feel like that there are some musics that are more deserving, or, of our intellectual curiosity. And that's, I think, a good thing.
Yeah. And sorry.
Go for it.
I was just thinking, I was reflecting on that recently about jazz and thinking, I think each of us tends to see jazz in this larger kind of universe of kinds of music. And I think as an ethnomusicologist, I'm not really a jazz purist. Like I love the way jazz meshes itself with all kinds of music, and the ways that lots of musicians who maybe don't get called jazz musicians draw on that music. I don't know, I've listened to Thundercat a lot lately, and there's so much jazz in that. Is that jazz? I can't answer or care about the question on some level,
And we're also really adept to pivoting. We have this site of inquiry, and then we're really also interested in like the lives of these people. And so as you were talking, I was reminded of Louis Armstrong, and how Louis Armstrong is one of the people that I like to think of as I pivot toward my interest in music and food. Because Louis Armstrong is one of the folks that people cite, who has, we have found a recipe of his mom's, I believe it was, I want to say gumbo. And that has become an entire conversation around maternal ties and how he nourished himself and others on the road. And ethnomusicology allows me to be able to think about the sort of fullness of a musician's experience while I pivot to something like gastromusicology.
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 It's very tasteful.
I'm into the flavor now.
Yeah.
My Lord, come on.
So basically what you're saying is ethnomusicology encompasses the artist, the music, the culture, just pretty much everything that's centered around the music, whether it's jazz or rock or gospel or blues. It's a full spectrum of that person or that culture's music. But there's no limit, because, like you were saying, Sting uses a lot of jazz in his music. He's a great jazz musician, even though most people don't know it. And we borrow from each other. Like my understanding of jazz was the African drum, to slavery, outlawed the drum, went to the guitar picked up gospel, church, blues, jazz, that's a very limited understanding of what ethnomusicology is about. Because in my mind, I separate both. I look at the artist and learn about the artist, but I never compared gastro and and cultural things necessarily. Okay, he's European, or he's African, or he's Jamaican, or he's Cuban, or he's Brazilian, and the influences. But it's like, like with Brazilian music or Cuban music, they borrow from jazz, but jazz also borrows from them.
Yeah.
Is that a part of the ethnomusicology study also?
For sure. Yeah, that sort of global story that jazz has lived. I mean, much of my research over the last, 10 years actually has been with indigenous musicians, Aboriginal musicians, and Pacific Islanders in Australia and other parts of the Pacific, and the ways that jazz has moved into, and not just jazz, right? Jazz and blues and gospel and all of this has become meaningful and powerful and part of a movement for recognition and sovereignty. And I think it gets back to why I think each of us sees the music as part of this larger world. That for the folks I work with there, it's not just the music; it's the ways the music was connected to, civil rights movement, of Black Power, Harlem Renaissance. I mean, the politics and the philosophy and the meaning and the spiritual meaning and all of this, like they have absorbed, they've recognized that, and it's become powerful and important and as music, but also as life.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we're more than music historians. I mean, many of us are really interested in the histories behind how musical genres developed. But I think a lot of us who self-identify as ethnomusicologists, we try to take it a step further, perhaps, and question like the stories that people tell about music. Like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves, even as academics, about where music came from? Like, like what is jazz after all? I'm very interested in sort of problematizing, the sort of the conventional narrative of jazz is the origins of jazz, and also let's look at some Caribbean sources and the ways in which these categories of music, jazz, R&B, how they're constructed over time, and how they're made meaningful to people in different societies. So it's the musical sound, it's the history of how things develop, but it's also how musical concepts and language about music is changing over time as well. Ethnomusicology is a lot of fun because you can do so many different things with it, and there's lots of questions that still need to be asked. And I think Dr. Solis and Dr. Jones are wonderful exemplars of this perpetual intellectual curiosity that's a healthy aspect of our discipline.
I would just also add that jazz, I think, is a great case study in how identity is formed, specifically transnational identity. We've already seen here in our conversation how jazz in many ways has been used as a means for cultural ambassadorship historically, a means for shared identity globally. And then when we think of our impact in the United States, with music being our number one export culture, music, jazz has been up there, high ranking as one of the chief ways that we are known sonically to the world. And so as we teach about jazz, you mentioned some of the prohibitions tied to African-derived musics in the United States, the prohibition of the drum or talking instruments. One of the things that I know my colleagues and I expose our students to is the long tradition of string musicianship that was brought to us by people of African ancestry.
Yes.
Guitar, the banjo, various chordal instruments. And in fact, I know my students, a lot of my graduate students are doing the great work of showing those flows from the continent throughout the world of these instruments that aren't immediately associated with Africanness, like the banjo. But we know through the work of Dr. JJ, who just became an honorary member with SEM, the Society for Ethnomusicology, groundbreaking work, still playing as a musician, largely because we are still teaching people about what we brought culturally to the United States. Yeah. So there's the drum that many people don't know about, the prohibition of the drumming, because it was thought to potentially organize enslaved Africans. People heard of the talking instrument. They heard of the talking drum. We know now that there are various instruments that talk or mimic the tonality of speech. But it was something about the drum that was so powerful and how it was described and used that as a result, it was prohibited. And I and others would argue that it shaped a cultural reception in the United States where people of various cultures are triggered by the drum, not realizing where that social epigenetic root lays. So we get into the issues. We like to think about the issues that form the music.
And since you're talking about Black music too, I mean, just building off of what Dr. Jones has said, too, it occurs to me too that it doesn't even go without saying to some of the listeners that, I think when we're talking about Black music, we also understand that musical sound is not it doesn't occur in a vacuum, that it's inextricably connected to so many different ways of living, of doing other things, of dancing, for example. So we tend to try to take a little bit more of a holistic approach to understanding what music is, right? One scholar named Christopher Small uses the term musicking to try to get at this, right? Like it's a verb, it's not a thing at all, it's an activity, right? So this idea that music is alive and well, and it's not just what's on a printed page, but it's an activity. It's something that people are engaged in, and that to understand it, even something like a jazz concert, you have to look at the interplay perhaps between performers and audiences. In the same way, that not just, I think that there's a lot to be gained, like thinking about like church music as well, like the Black church, how the amens and cries of hallelujah from the congregation, they all contribute to the musical event. Right? So an event-centered approach, I think, is often key to what we do in ethnomusicology.
Yeah, and I would add a thing to this, which is to say, I think a lot of jazz musicians historically have grown up in that world, and if not, perhaps needed to articulate it as explicitly, but for those of us who teach at universities that have jazz programs, we are often teaching students who have come to jazz perhaps in other ways, often white students, of course, but who have not necessarily grown up with some of those codes and some of those experiences, and so part of the work is also expanding their understanding of what jazz is. But I would also say, Carl, that it seems to me that you are an ethnomusicologist in your approach to jazz on this show, because it sounds to me, having brought in not just musicians, but also producers and songwriters and now scholars, that you have taken a sort of musicking approach to understanding the music.
I mean, it was interesting as a DJ, I was interviewing somebody, I can't remember who it was, and I was asking how it was he was wearing so many hats. And he was like, well, how is it that you're wearing so many hats? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm a DJ. He's like, no, you're a DJ, you're a programmer, you're a arranger, You know, not like arranger. He's like, well, you arrange the music every night. You know, you put one song after the other, you know, and I was like, oh, wow, you know. And
Absolutely.
until he said it, I never thought about it that way, you know. But you're right, you know, in terms of how we approach music and how we look at it, it stems from how our ears were trained, you know, because I grew up in Broadway and jazz, but then the 60s hit, you know, and I turned to the British invasion. I turned to Motown. I turned to Muscle Shoals, you know, and all this other music started to come in, you know, then I went West Coast and, you know, a whole nother sound, you know. And then eventually I returned to my roots, which was jazz, you know. And I mean, I still listen to, Michael Jackson and, you know, Led Zeppelin and, you know, the Beach Boys and, you know, all those other groups that, you know, were there in my musical development, which helps me not be as subjective in my thoughts about music, because I found out that everybody borrows from everybody. You know, the Rolling Stones went to Muscle Shoals and sat and listened to learn, you know. So my question now is, you know, coming out of a quote unquote European history, you know, we're taught European history, which left out all of the Black history of the world as I was growing up. Is the study, you know, is the scholarship of ethnomusicology, is there a consensus between white and Black scholars in terms of the beginnings because of a universal colonial education where we were left out of the conversation, out of the narrative for so long?
That's such a large question, my friend. Oh my God. I need a sip of water.
You're asking whether there is a consensus across racial boundaries about where music came from in general, or?
Yeah, because I mean, like, you know, when we look at history, there's what was taught from the colonial standpoint, and what we have learned since Black studies hit college universities. You know, that we were there long before them, you know, kind of stuff. Is that the same thing? You know, I mean, I'm assuming, and I know what assuming does, but, you know, as Black scholars, are you discovering inequities in the narrative that has previously been told?
You know, well, let me say this. I think one of the things that disappointed me, I think, once I really entered the academic life as a professional scholar, is that, and even as a graduate student, you know, in my PhD program, you learn fairly quickly that things like white supremacy or racism that the academy is not immune from those forces, and that they're alive and well, even in scholarly organizations that you might assume to be progressive, even within the Society for Ethnomusicology, you know, which is a grand cohort of scholars, most of whom are committed to studying the world's music in all of its diversity. But nevertheless, we still battle against this sort of systemic problem that foregrounds whiteness and white ways of thinking, white ways of making music. I don't think that it's a question of like Black scholars and white scholars disagreeing, certainly not on an obvious, you know, ostensible level. It really goes beyond individual scholars, because many people mean well. I think that if you ask a lot of, you know, African-American, you know, African Caribbean, you know, Black scholars and Black graduate students, they have a lot of stories to tell and scars to show you about the trials and tribulations of trying to either earn their PhD, get their articles published, get books published, And some of those obstacles have to do with the fact that we live and operate and work within a system that still tends to undervalue not only Black ways of making music, but Black centered scholarship as well. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of what I would say about that. But I would love to hear from Dr. Jones as well.
I would just add, we've been working on a project actually centered around radio and listening, and revisiting the story of a foremother, Dr. Eileen Southern, who is said to be one of the, if not the first, one of the first, but I think the first to submit a dissertation in musicology as an African American. That was 60 years ago. And for much of her career, she spent a lot of correspondence, blood, sweat, and tears, and pages in her book responding to the assertion that there's no way there could possibly be enough material to teach a course on Black music research. And as a result of that journey, we get the book, The Music of Black Americans, which anytime I teach Black music research, I use that book as a conversation starter about the baton that she passed on to us on her departure. That was done 50 years ago this year. 60 and 50 years are marked this year. It's not lost on me, though, that, like Toni Morrison said, racism was such a distraction from the creative work that she could do, from the entrepreneurial acumen that she had by creating her own journal. And today, I still encounter the same sorts of questions and curiosities and omissions that Dr. Southern encountered as the first tenured woman at Harvard University, tenured African American woman. And so telling the history is so important. And I think now we are at a point, as we look at the Society for Ethnomusicology, the American Musicological Society, all of the major musical guilds like the Society for American Music, there is some self-reflection that is occurring. I don't think, though, that scholars of color need to be included in that reflection. I can miss me with another service or conversation opportunity. I got books. I want to talk about music and food. Like, I want to be,
You want to chair the diversity committee on the.
I know, that is a mess. But I mean, she was able to at least start the conversation about the role of visual arts and music. So that pivoted. And with that almost 600-page book, it was like grit. It was her grit, making sure that folks like us could benefit from a comprehensive body of literature that could put to rest the question of whether or not there was a there in Black music research. But unfortunately, I'm telling you, we're still getting that question today.
Yes, yeah. I'm so glad Dr. Jones gave a shout out to Eileen Southern. She is a true hero, I mean, in the history of the study of African American music. And she got a PhD from NYU. And didn't do a dissertation on Black music. She really had to do that afterwards, after she got her PhD. When I finished my PhD from NYU in 2005, I didn't know that Eileen Southern had gotten her doctorate there, and I didn't know of any other African Americans who had been there. So I started asking around, and it turned out like I was the second African American to get a PhD in music from NYU. So I'm very much, operating in the footsteps, in the shadows, so to speak, of Eileen Southern. We all owe a great debt to her.
Yeah. And I will say, I'm not a Black scholar. I don't identify as an African American scholar, but I've been very fortunate to be in the community of scholars and have the opportunity to pursue jazz studies in that context, and to see changes over the years in that I've mentored a number of Black students, and been able to grow that community as well, and produce a space where I hope to some degree there's some refuge from some of the ways that the larger institution can be a damaging place to be in a place like Champaign-Urbana. But I will say one thing that I think has changed is, at least where I am, and I hope at large, is the thing about what music can you study for your dissertation? What can be your real project? And even when I started graduate school in the early 90s, mid 90s, there was a kind of sense that for a lot of people, well, you'd still do classical music thing for your first project, and then you do, jazz or some other kind of gospel or whatever it is. And I think that's not the case anymore for the most part. But I also, I did not start as an ethnomusicologist. I thought of myself as a music historian, and I said, I'm gonna write a dissertation about Thelonious Monk. This is for me. And my professors came to me and said, oh, well, you're an ethnomusicologist. I said, what's that? That sounds like racism. And really fortunate. I was very fortunate to have the advisor I had, who is now the Quincy Jones Professor of Music at Harvard University, Ingrid. And I said, Ingrid, this seems like that. And she said, oh yeah, no, it is. Totally. That's what it is. Also, don't worry about that right now. Find the conversations you want to be part of. Meet the people you want to talk with. And now I get to talk with them on this show. So, it's, yeah, for sure.
I got to shout out my dissertation advisor, Dr. Butler. I know he doesn't require it, but in the Black church, first giving honor to God and mentors. But I say that because rightly, I would not have been able to study Black music research, at least with the opportunity to be imaginative, had I not had someone like Dr. Butler, who is a rigorous scholar and whose musicianship matches his rigor as a scholar. So, I know you didn't pay me, but the invoice is in the email.
Thank you so much. You started talking about your dissertation advisor. I was like, oh, who was that? Oh no, that was me. So, Alisha Jones was my first PhD advisee. When I was teaching at the University of Chicago, and it's easy to forget that she was ever a student because, she's now blossomed into this powerhouse of a scholar with her recent book, Flaming. Which you have to check out. It's a wonderful colleague now. It's really great and to see that happen. So thank you for those kind words.
Thank you. And the first PhD in ethnomusicology, person of African ancestry at U Chicago.
Congratulations. Definitely.
Wow, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. And I do think that's a sign of the distance there is still to go. That really, I don't know what year you got your PhD, but it was not that long ago.
Yeah.
And, I think if you picked any given department, their first Black student to get a PhD may well have been within the last 10 years, and was almost certainly within the last 20. Yeah. And many of those schools, maybe there hasn't been another, and this is the, this, and I will say as a scholar who's come to jazz studies, not growing up in the Black community, that having experiences with Black family members, learning that a little bit later in my life, did make a difference in how I hear jazz and how I approach it as a scholar. And I think that is a reason why I am always looking to recruit Black students into my graduate program to study that music, because I think it did matter. And
Yeah. So glad to hear you say that, Dr. Solis. Yeah. And, I think all of us would agree that it matters who's at the table, right?
Yeah.
And Black voices matter. I mean, if you heard, Amanda Gorman's speech at the inauguration, right? I mean, what a powerful voice. I mean, and speaking as a young Black woman, it matters. It makes a difference that we hear her voice, that we see her, and we recognize that she has a distinctive story to tell because of her distinctive set of experiences that make her who she is. Likewise, in the academy, it matters not only what we're studying, but who is telling the story, right? Who is studying? And we understand that knowledge is, none of us would say that we are producing like the objective truth. Like, this is the way it was. Like, no, we understand that there's a dialogue between the scholar and the thing that we're studying. So I write a book. This is Melvin Butler's take on, this is my analysis of what's happening here based on the research that I've done. And I remember being so discouraged when I first entered my PhD program, because I was reading all of these things on Black music and jazz and gospel that were written like decades ago by white scholars who tended to be rather dismissive of the cultural value of Black expressive culture of music. I mean, it sort of like it was important on to a certain extent, but they just didn't quite write with the same kind of sensitivity. Right. And so there's a long history of that, and we're still, I think, trying to get to a point where we have, a better representation of diverse voices, and that our academic spaces are inclusive enough to really provide a healthy portrait of various forms of Black music. And it really takes a collective effort, I think, on the part of all of us to do that.
Similarly, why our continued musical involvement matters, why it informs what we bring to the classroom. We have a term that my predecessor here at IU really championed, which is culture bearing. This idea of understanding our role culturally, especially within the tradition of jazz, within vernacular or popular Black music, where in many cases, in our living rooms or at our kitchen tables, don't nobody care about how you unpack X, Y, and Z scholar. They want to know, can you take us in musically? Like, how does this match with your earthly good in our home, at our family reunion, at momentous occasions? And so that culture bearing, much like what we've seen with the griot, the person who carries the history and activates space through song, through poetry, having those ways of knowing the music is so important. And it really, it also, for me, is the nourishing part, where I can take what I teach to a predominantly white student body of maybe 180 students per semester. I can teach and use the pedagogical moves in the classroom and work with denominations, work with conservatories to reimagine even some of the places that have rejected and erased my proposal to either study there or work there, but now to be in a space where I'm audible and legible in new ways, and to make a way for someone who had a similar path. It's a great joy. And so those credentials, they mean something, at least for preventing other violences from happening to other people. So yeah.
I've also thought one of the things that often characterizes ethnomusicologists is sharing the mic in terms of who has expertise, who brings what knowledge to the table. So, I have learned over the years about Central African music, but I have a friend here who I play with a lot, who's a Congolese musician who in Congo was a major figure in gospel there, and left because of the political situation. I would much rather give him the space and recognize his expertise and allow my students to see expertise in his person than for me to try to pretend I'm the expert. And I think that's a mark of ethnomusicology as an approach, actually.
Yeah, and it's a shame. I mean, there used to be a time when, and maybe this still exists, I don't know what you guys think. There used to be a time when, like playing the music was like a mark against you. Like
Right.
the idea that we are the scholars, we don't actually touch
Right.
the music. Like we don't play it. We analyze it. As this division between performers and scholars, between thinking and doing, like. And so it's great to be on this panel because all of us are music makers as well. Which, as Dr. Jones said too, right? This affords us a different kind of knowledge, a way of knowing and understanding the music, a kind of insight. I think that's valuable in the classroom and in the articles and books that we write.
I mean, one of the things I noticed in, over the years is that, especially like with jazz and a lot of Black music, it was always seedy and lowbrow. And, and I understand, jazz came out of Storyville in New Orleans, which was the bordello section of New Orleans. But then it got raised to this highbrow regal status where people were like, I don't know if I even understand it now because it's way up there. And, for me, it's always been, if it makes you bop your head, tap your foot, snap your fingers, it's good music. It doesn't matter whether it's lowbrow, highbrow. I mean, I've been in some joints where I had to put my back against the wall to make sure I was safe, but enjoy the music at the same time, because that's where the real players were playing, at the juke joint, where a fight could break out at any moment, So there was never a lowbrow or highbrow, but then, like you were saying, as historians, as scholars, that's a narrative that I am sure Black folks didn't create. So how do we get around and reestablish a new narrative that is inclusive of our history? Because in a lot of cases, that's the only place we could play. We couldn't play at the Copa, or, we couldn't play Las Vegas or Miami Beach in the early days, and then when they allowed us, we couldn't stay there. So how does the scholarship change that narrative? And I know that's probably another big question, right, Dr. Jones?
Yeah. My
Yeah.
immediate thought is public arts education. We might readily associate it with public schools, which is one strand, and then there's community organizations. I often think about how the Academy of the Church has served as that outlet, and maybe now is the time in terms of the historicity of jazz music, where we may see folks bringing jazz education into the churches, largely because of the defunding of jazz education privately and publicly. The repertoire, and of course we can include jazz vespers, we can include sacred concerts in this as well. The repertoire is just so rich. And when I think of the musicians who are out here recording, when we ask them some questions, the music directors out here like Tony Walker and Daniel Moore, these folks who are entrusted with the musical vision of headliners like Ledisi and Mariah Carey, they did the Academy of the Church and they did jazz education and were equipped with sonic and musical material. Even people like Melvin Butler was raised in the Academy of the Church and went to places like Berkeley, rubbed shoulders with, a Layla Hathaway and, Lil Jon, and, can whip out saxophones in the background. But this sacred secular duality does not exist, and we don't need for it to persist as though it exists. I think we could bring jazz education into the public arts education that's already percolating in our churches, especially as we re-envision them in this pandemic moment.
Yeah, and I think so much about what Dr. Butler was saying about like questioning the histories. I really push when I'm teaching jazz history about, you know, the ways that the musicians have been intellectuals from the jump, and the ways that the music, this, I don't know, it was a good thing to do because it was a way to make a good living at a point. You know, Coleman Hawkins did not come out of, you know, the kind of low brow situation. He was well to do. I mean, you know,
Miles Davis, right?
Davis, there were people, and there were music educators. This music was something that grew because there was public funding for music education in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in et cetera. And you know, I think that story is an important one for people who want to be in this music to hear, and people who love this music to know.
Okay, real quick, because we got to wrap up. I mean, I hate for this to end because this is
just like, getting warmed up too, right?
You know what I'm talking about? So, real quick, a lot of musicians are moving away from the word jazz. And, you know, like Nicholas Payton, Black American music. God, who is it? I can't even think. But anyway, there's creating new terms for the music that they play because jazz had such a negative connotation to it. How do we keep, you know, how do we keep the word jazz alive? Because I can't, you know, it's hard to say, you know, like Yusef Lateef, auto, physio, psychic music. You know, who else falls into that category? You know, because jazz already has so many different categories in it.
Yeah, I'm glad you posed this question, Carl, because I was kind of sitting here thinking that, man, you know, I have a problem with the term jazz too. I mean, I think it's never been you know, all that clearly defined, and it's always meant different things. I mean, it's if you think about the original Dixieland Jazz Band, when did they record? Like 1917 or something? Is that right? Those were not African Americans, right? And Paul Whiteman was known as the king of jazz. He was not an African American, right? You know, the term has always, in a sense, been co-opted, you know, by others, you know, in the music industry, you know, by different folks, and it's as a label. I think there's no need for me as a jazz musician to feel like indebted to that term. You know, I've allowed myself to untether myself from jazz as defining what I do. I think even from a historical standpoint, I mean, you have to think about jazz as a huge umbrella term that really encompasses a huge constellation of styles, some of which are remarkably different from one another, right? So I don't think we're in danger of losing the term because it has this currency. It means a lot of different things to different people. For my mom, it might mean Boney James or Kenny G, you know, or you know, for me, it might mean Dexter Gordon and John Coltrane, you know. And as far as Louis Armstrong was concerned, I think what Charlie Parker and Miles Davis were doing in the 40s, that it wasn't the same kind of music necessarily either. I don't know, but maybe then again, one of the roles that we have as scholars is figuring out like, what are the through lines? What do all these different, you know, various forms of musical performance have in common? And maybe the term jazz has some utility in that way, but I'm not married to it.
I struggle with it because I see certainly Duke Ellington rejected.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
True.
And yet, I also want to celebrate. You know, I think the point you're pointing to. I want to celebrate this historical patrimony. I mean, I think there is some truly great thing that happened over the course of the long 20th century and continues to happen today with musicians improvising in a tradition that has its roots and its life in African American music, and that is different from R&B. It is different from gospel, and it's different from hip hop, and that's not a knock on any of those kinds of music or on jazz, but to say that while the boundaries are pretty fluid and the relationships are pretty strong, also there is some body of wonder to me in a music that goes from Louis Armstrong through John Coltrane and Dexter Gordon, to whoever you want to name today, including Nicholas Payton, even if we don't want to call it that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add, I was thinking Ellington as well. I'm a true Washingtonian, and the politics that emerged from his assertion of America's music really was, in this moment, a story that we need to know of personhood and citizenship. Yeah. It was a way of him talking about being a Black man doing good music. And it's a longer discussion, but I think it's one that needs to be lifted up as we talk about patriotism and representing oneself on a global stage. Because when you Google, in many ways, his name pops up as the American composer because of that. So what are the politics of representation there when we talk about reach and impact in the marketplace?
Okay, that's a conversation for another time. Talk about a long conversation. Anyway, doctors, I tip my hat to you, and I thank you so much, Dr. Alisha Lola Jones, Dr. Gabriel Solis, and Dr. Melvin Butler for joining me on this edition of Conversations of Jazz and Other Distractions. I also want to thank my audience for your continued support, my producer, Ravi Wyndham, our marketing guru, Karen Hatchett, for always doing a fantastic job, as both of you both do. I thank the Hammonds House Museum, the Fulton County Arts Council, the City of Atlanta Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs, AT&T Times Warner Media, the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, and NPN for always being there and continuing to support these kinds of conversations and the arts. Until next time, lady and gentlemen, again, thank you for joining me on this edition of Conversations about Jazz and Other Distractions.
Thank you.
Thank you.